I'm not going to tell you everything about everything. I'll try to tell you some stuff about some stuff. So my name's Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester. So as that bit of housekeeping that Martha was mentioning, if you do just want to see me and not see everybody, what you can do is you can take your cursor and you can hover it over my face, my little video box, and you'll see that a little icon that looks like a thumbtack will come up. And if you click that thumbtack, I should stay up there, and you should just be able to see me if you want to see me. I'll give you sort of my my general spiel about what a county forester is and what I do, and then we'll go and we'll start talking about managing forests for wildlife. So my name's Ethan Tapper. I'm the Chittenden County Forester. The County Forester program has been around in Vermont since the 40s, and basically what it is the way that the state supports the management of privately owned forests and ecosystems in our state. So Vermont's about 75% forested. 80% of those lands are privately owned, most of them by individuals and families. And so if you think about what I say is private forests have public benefits. So those privately owned forested lands are producing these massive benefits that we all enjoy. They're producing clean air and clean water, wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration and storage, flood attenuation, all these other things that are really sort of in the public trust, but are ultimately produced by people with a piece of land that they pay taxes on every year and that they take care of. And so it's really, really important that we give those people the right tools to understand how to manage their land responsibly. And that's what the county foresters do. There's 13 of us for the 14 counties. And I would say that it basically boils down to, I do basically 4 different things. So the first thing that I do is I manage this program called the Current Use Program, the Use Value Appraisal Program, which is a tax abatement program for landowners who have more than 25 acres of forested land. They basically have to manage their land in relation to a forest management plan that's developed by a professional consulting forester and is approved by me. And they agree to not subdivide or develop their land unless they have to pay a penalty. And in exchange, they get a big tax break. So their land is reassessed at its use value rather than its full fair market value. And so they pay less in taxes. That's a big part of the job of county foresters. In some counties, that's like pretty much all the county forester does, because it's a really important program, and it allows us to help people manage their land better and sort of have a carrot and a stick to accomplish that. But you know, in some of these other counties, it's a huge part of the county forester's job. The second part of my job is that if you own forested land, a piece of forested land of any size, you can call me up and we'll go take a walk and talk about what's going on in your forest, how to manage it better, et cetera, answer any questions you have about it, et cetera. So just generally providing sort of service in that way for free. The third thing that I do is I help the towns manage their municipal forests, so their town forests, community forests. I work really closely with a couple of communities and sort of help them manage their community forests so they're a better resource for the landscape, and then also using them as a place to demonstrate responsible forest management. And then finally, the fourth thing is what I call whatever. So it's just sort of being creative with the amount of time that I have left in answering the question of how do we improve the health of forests and the quality of forest management in our county. And this is where the county foresters really get to be creative and adaptive and sort of address threats and opportunities as we see them in our county, and do all kinds of exciting and interesting stuff. So that said, I'm going to jump into this presentation. If you have questions, please hold them to the end. You can type them into the chat, or you can ask me at the end of the presentation. So hopefully we'll have some time for that. I haven't done this presentation exactly as it currently exists, so we'll see how the time management side of this works. Okay.
Like a bigger.
Hey, Martha, can you just verify that you're seeing my opening slide here?
I'm not.
You're not?
No, still seeing you.
Martha, just unpin him.
Yeah, maybe you should actually hover back over me and unpin me.
Okay.
I see you.
Oh, Yeah, now I've got it.
Now you got it?
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe you can't have both the pin and the shared screen here. So you see that black bear and everything?
So is everyone able to see you may have to unpin Ethan.
Click that, yeah, click that thumbtack icon again, I guess, if you're only seeing my face.
So go hover over his face and hit the tack again. Is everybody all set? Can they see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So managing Vermont's forest for wildlife. So again, here's just a sort of restate of what I just said. So we're primarily forested state, about 4.5 million acres of forests, and 80% of those lands are privately owned. 21% are publicly owned. The federal government owns about 500,000 acres. The state owns about 350,000 acres, and municipalities and other local entities own about 75,000 acres.
I'm sorry, either Marge has raised her hand. Is that a question, Marge?
If we can, let's hold the questions till the end, and then we can answer them all at once, because I can't see anybody.
It has this little icon that pops up with a raised hand, and that popped up. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay. All right, so yeah, we are also part of sort of a bigger regional picture. So we're part of the largest, most intact temperate deciduous forest in the world. It's just a huge stretch that goes up from the Adirondacks all the way over to Nova Scotia. It's a globally significant region. It's home to over 5 million people and thousands of species of wildlife and plants. It also has regional connectivity significance. So both within our state and also within the region, Vermont is this really important connector block, crossroads between both this from east to west to east, and also from north to south through these big blocks of intact habitat. So, while we tend to think about forest just in our community, in our state, it's also important to recognize that the importance of having healthy forests actually expands beyond the boundaries of our state and has regional and global significance. Here's a really cool graphic. This is showing the migrations of mammals, birds, and amphibians in our country. Or in North America. What you're seeing is that the north really functions as this pinch point. There's a lot of animals that are moving through these areas, part of really important habitat for breeding birds, tropical songbirds, and for many other things. So I like to start most of my presentations, but it's especially really important to talk about when you think about wildlife with a discussion of the history of Vermont. So prior to European settlement, 300, 400 years ago, Vermont was about 90-95% forested. And what we saw in the early 1800s, many of you already sort of know this story, but following the Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808, merino sheep were imported to Vermont. They were producing this really valuable, high-quality wool, and sheep raised just about anywhere. And what happened is that everybody in Vermont lost their minds. And by 1837, there was 1 to 1.7 million sheep in Vermont. So we think about 80% of Vermont was cleared for pasture by the mid-1800s. And it was relatively short-lived. So, if you think about going from 90 and 95% forested to only 20% forested, that's an amazing shift. And by the 1850s, those wool markets crashed, and we started to see some of those areas reverting back to forest. Many of them didn't revert back to forest until early mid-1900s, and some of them still aren't forest again. So if you think about, one of the things that's really crazy to think about is that here you have these forests that have been developing in Vermont thousands of years, and within 50 years, they're pretty much all gone. And what that means is that almost every forest that you've ever been in, unless you're standing on top of a mountain or somewhere really remote, was a pasture, or at the very least repeatedly clear-cut at this time. So I'm really interested in old-growth forests and what that tells us about the way that forests naturally grow and develop. And so we think that in New England, about 55 to 60% of our forests were older than 150 years old, what we might call old growth. prior to European settlement, and today it's about 0.5%. The loss of old growth forests, which we're going to talk about, and the unique habitat they provide has really long-lasting and enduring impacts on the health of our forests and also on native wildlife. So the impacts of this sort of landscape level change in the 1800s and what has happened since on wildlife is pretty profound. So we extirpated, just meaning pushed out of the state and drove to extinction, in some cases, many species of wildlife between the 1700s and the 1800s. So that includes beaver, turkey, fisher, moose, caribou, elk, catamount, wolves, bear, otter, Canada geese, marten, passenger pigeons, and more. What you see in front of you here is the last eastern cougar, also known as the catamount, that was shot in Vermont in 1881. The species was declared extinct in 2018. And the result of this has been, in the case of almost all those species, they were driven to extinction by a combination of, in some cases, over-harvesting, over-hunting. So in the case of those predators, there was a bounty that was placed on them in the late 1700s. In the case of beaver, for instance, they were trapped basically to local extinction and habitat loss, right? Because Vermont was pretty much all forest, and then it became all fields in a very short period of time. So in the case of beavers is a really good sort of example of some of the effects of this, because beavers are what we might call a keystone species. So a keystone species is a species, usually a wildlife, that has a disproportionate effect on its environment. So beavers provide habitat for many other different species of wildlife, from vertebrates, bugs, to insects, to birds and aquatic organisms, to amphibians and reptiles, by having waterways, creating basically wetlands. Beavers were also really well, highly sought after for their pelts. They were driven to extinction in most of Europe by the early 1600s. And so then what people did is basically start trapping beavers in North America. And it's been estimated that beavers were incredibly abundant in North America prior to European settlement. That there may have been as many as 300 beaver dams per square mile in valley habitats. So a square mile is 640 acres. So that's a beaver dam every 2 acres. A massive abundance of beaver. And think about all the habitat that would create. So these beaver wetlands are these incredibly diverse, rich places. They support this incredible diversity of organisms. And also have influences over hydrology, disturbance regimes, or stuff like that. And so to lose all that in a relatively short period of time could cause these massive sort of what we call cascading effects on a whole different range of wildlife across the landscape. We think that there were over 250,000 beavers shipped to Europe from the Connecticut River Valley alone by 1670. So that's an incredible amount of beavers to be trapped really even before what we consider the traditional period of European colonization of this continent. So beavers are not the only species that has a profound impact over their environment. So, as we know, with some of our predator reintroductions out west, with the reintroductions of wolves and grizzly bears, predators also could be seen to be keystone species because of their influence over the populations of different herbivores. And that cascades down into changing the way that the herbivores browse and eat some trees and other vegetation, which causes ecosystem-wide implications. And so we lost those apex predators. Another example of this is that when we extirpated the fisher, which is a species of animal that most people do not like because it eats our house pets and it's really scary and really intense predator. That was the native predator of the porcupine. So in the early mid-1900s, there was a bounty on porcupines because they became so overpopulated that they were just like eating people's houses. And you could turn in a pair of porcupine ears to the town clerk and get issued a bounty. The fisher and the beaver, the fisher, the beaver, the turkey, and even white-tailed deer were all reintroduced into Vermont. In addition to in addition to the marten and some of these other species. So it's just pretty incredible. Really the beaver, turkey, deer, some of these other species are these incredible success stories. But the fact that they were removed from our landscape has really huge implications over our landscape itself. And so the legacy of the 1800s, obviously, there are enduring legacies on those wildlife populations and the way they use our landscape, but also over our forests. So you may walk in the forest and be like, it looks pretty nice. There are trees here. What you don't see is that those forests are qualitatively different than the forests that were here a few hundred years ago. So we talked about, 55–60% of our forests were what we might call old growth prior to European settlement. Now, most of our forests are less than 100 years old. 100 years is a long time, but for forests to develop really these sort of characteristics that we associate with old growth take multiple generations of trees, many hundreds of years to develop. Our forests are younger, they're less diverse, they lack big trees, dead wood, soil carbon like we might have had a few hundred years ago, and our landscapes lack a historical balance of different forest ages and types. So just as our forests haven't had a chance to become diverse by just being allowed to be forests for a long period of time, our landscapes haven't had a chance to become diverse because they just haven't had enough time to develop as ecosystems. And all this has really stark implications over wildlife, because wildlife use different structures in forests that we're going to talk about, different forest ages and sizes, the different species of trees that colonize forests at different developmental stages. They use them in different ways. So a couple things to keep in your mind as wildlife lovers and forest lovers. About forests, there's two big myths that I like to tell people about in the way that we understand forests that most people misunderstand. The first myth is that healthy forests are supposed to look neat and tidy. So I don't know where it comes from, and I've heard all kinds of theories about it, but most people think that an idyllic, the best possible looking forest is a forest that looks like a park. It's got evenly spaced trees, nothing growing in the understory. You walk into a forest like that, and you're just like intuitively, you're like, yes, that looks really nice. However, that is a forest that is not very functional. It's not very healthy. Healthy forests are diverse, and what that means is they look messy. There are all different species and shapes and sizes of trees, dead trees on the ground, dead standing trees. If you walk into a forest that has a really good mix of different habitat types, you would say, wow. You would not say, wow, this looks really nice. And you certainly would not call it neat and tidy. So as we think about how we want to manage our forest, the first thing we need to do is understand what healthy forests look like. And the first step of that is realizing that they actually look pretty messy. This is me here standing in front of these people and telling them about why I think it's a really good thing that these trees fell over. Right? So forests, well, let me go back to the next slide. So the other myth is that forests are static. They are unchanging. When in reality, forests are dynamic. So forests are changing all the time. They just change so slowly that it's really hard for us to understand the ways that they're changing. In a forest, death, mortality, change, disturbances, like what happened when this tree fell over here in this gap that created by falling. This is profound and beautiful, and this is something that fuels better habitat, more complexity, more diversity in the forest. There's this incredible cycle that happens where anytime that negative space is created, that light is allowed to hit the forest floor, it is just filled with regeneration. This tree falls over, and even though it's sad that that tree died in some ways, it's beautiful that what's going to happen in the space that was created by that tree is this really amazing abundance and regeneration of different species of trees and shrubs and herbaceous plants, different ages of trees, different sizes of trees, which will be utilized by wildlife in different ways. So it's really important, in addition to recognize that forests aren't supposed to look clean and neat and tidy, that forests are also dynamic and they're supposed to be changing all the time. Like I said earlier, am really into old growth forests. So eastern old growth forests are a really good way, by studying them, we can understand how forests naturally grow and develop over time, right? Because we don't have that many examples of forests that have been able to develop and just be forests for longer than a few hundred years. And so by studying old growth forests, the remnant old growth patches that we can have a better understanding of what forests do when they manage themselves. And so again, I think there's this misunderstanding. People think of old growth forests as, it looks like a park with really big old trees. And so while it is true that there will be some big old trees and even pockets of big old trees, really they're defined not by their uniformity, but by their complexity. So there's many different sizes and ages of trees. There's gaps in the canopy, so just holes in the canopy where one of those big trees has fallen over and created space, light, tons of dead wood on the ground, and a really diverse tree species composition, usually dominated by our species of trees that grow better in the shade. So that would be like hemlock, beech, sugar maple. All of these features are not only just what old growth forests are like, take it or leave it, but they also happen to be features that benefit wildlife in a lot of different ways. And I'm going to talk about those features sort of individually and the way in which we want to manage our forest for those features in the process of managing for wildlife. Just a quick anecdote about old growth forests in general. There's a really good list. If you want to go see what an old growth forest looks like, and again, there's, this is a general description of what they look like because they're defined, again, not by their stability, their uniformity, or their regularity, but by their complexity and their irregularity. So they look in all different kinds of ways. There's a little patch of old growth-ish forest in Charlotte called Williams Woods. I think it's on East Thompson's Point Road. I took a group out there and we looked at it. We walked through this area that had these big, tall pine trees. That was a field 80 years ago. And people were like, wow, this looks really nice. And then we entered the part of it that was old growth. And one of the people in the group said, oh, I don't like that. And the reason is because it looks messy. There was dead trees lying on the ground all over the place. There was an understory that was so thick you couldn't see through it in some places. There were trees standing, with all kinds of holes in them. And it just wasn't something that is intuitively pleasant to us. But all of those features are really, really important to wildlife and to the health of forests and their resilience in general. So when we think about how we manage for wildlife, sometimes we'll think about, employing sort of a coarse filter or a fine filter or a combination thereof. A coarse filter is the idea that if examples of all habitat types are conserved at the scale at which they naturally occur in our landscape, most of these wildlife species are going to, from trees, mammals, most of the species in general, from trees, plants, mammals, birds, insects, will also be conserved. So you protect the habitat, which is most of what I've been talking about here, protecting the habitat, protecting healthy forests, and with that will come all of these wildlife species because they use those forests. Some individual species will always need special attention. So the coarse filter is sort of protecting the habitats in general and assuming that the wildlife species are going to come along with them. The fine filter is protecting individual species that are special and that need special protection. And that should also be part of what we try to do is protect biodiversity sort of at a large scale with a coarse filter approach, and then try and protect our native species with a fine filter approach at the same time. So now I'm going to sort of go into some of the different things that we're going to try and manage our forests for and some of the ways in which they benefit wildlife. All right. Big trees. So one of the weirdest things that I do when I'm managing forests, so I'm a forester. I'm what I call a tinkerer. So I like doing stuff. I like seeing, thinking about the way in which I can be, as a human, actually a positive influence on our landscape, and to sort of manage forests in a restorative or regenerative way to make them more healthy, to help them recover from some of the past effects of human land use on them. And so one thing that foresters in general and loggers are not used to doing is leaving big trees in the woods. But the problem is when you cut all of the big trees, you miss out on some really important and cool habitat. So big trees have complex canopies that provide unique nesting and foraging habitat for birds, mammals. They have thick, craggy bark which provides habitat for small animals like bats. So bats will roost under shaggy bark on trees, especially the Indiana bat. Arthropods will make, so that's bugs, basically spiders and insects, will live in the cracks of the bark and the little fissures and the holes in those big trees, and will also be foraged for by some of our bark foraging birds like brown creeper and our nuthatches, chickadee. These big trees will have big cavities, and especially you need big trees with big cavities for species like barred owl, pileated woodpeckers, and even bears have been known to hibernate in large tree cavities with great success. Our understanding of forests as it increases, one of the sort of things that most people are excited about forests right now is the understanding of how they're connected below the soil. So there are these fungal networks, what's called mycorrhizal fungi. They're basically just these little fungal threads that permeate the soil and that actually have a symbiotic relationship with trees. So they help trees absorb nutrients and water out of the soil, and the trees in exchange share with them photosynthetic sugars, basically carbon. They also facilitate resource sharing between trees. So trees, especially big trees, are known to be sort of hubs in this network where they're subsidizing smaller trees and weaker trees. There's all kinds of cool research about the ways in which trees are connected and the ways in which they use those underground fungal connections to communicate with each other and share resources and behave altruistically, which is pretty cool. And so we also want to save big trees for that reason. Big trees I also think about as future big chunks of dead wood, which I'll talk about in a second, which is really, really important. And it's also habitat, as you can see on this one, for unusual species of lichens, mosses, and other bryophytes, liverwort, stuff like that, that we want to support because we want to support everything, all native species in our forests. We also want to cultivate complexity in our forest. So structural diversity, what that means is that, the way we're used to talking about diversity is just the number of different species of trees, let's say, or animals in a given area. Structural diversity is sort of saying not what's there, but the way in which those trees are growing that are there. So it's a forest that is structurally diverse, has many different ages and sizes of trees. So vertical structural diversity we'd refer to as a range of different tree sizes, ages, and species. Horizontal structural diversity we would call when there's pockets of forest in different stages of development. So you're walking through the forest and it's not just all trees that are the same age, or even, trees interspersed with one another. You run into a pocket of trees that are all 15 years old. And then you walk a little bit further and you run into a pocket of trees that are all 150 years old. And so having that horizontal diversity, in addition to that vertical diversity, provides really important different habitats for animals. So the easiest way to illustrate that is with birds. So there are species of birds who need mature forest, a pretty closed, intact canopy, tall trees. There are species of birds who require very young forest. And there are species of birds who require all different types of forests for different parts of their life. So, maybe they require young shrubby forest habitat, a pocket of regeneration that's less than 5 years old for nesting, but they like foraging in, mature forest canopies, and they like, using some other, middle-aged forests in vertically structurally diverse forests for singing perches and for their mating display. So providing that whole range of different conditions, not just the species we have, but growing in different ways, gives us a better chance at capturing a whole range of different wildlife as well. We also know that structurally diverse forests are healthier. They're more resilient to disturbances. We expect them to be more resilient to climate change, and they're more like old growth forests. So we're not just creating some weird condition by making a forest with a lot of different ages and sizes of trees in it. We're actually making forests, if we're managing them for structural diversity, we're making them more like the old growth forests that used to be so common on our landscape. Dead wood, I put dead in quotes because actually it's far from dead in many respects, is really important on our landscape. It's also called coarse woody debris, coarse woody material. necromass. Sometimes in the scientific literature, living wood will be biomass, dead wood will be necromass. I just think it's a cool vocab word. One of the craziest things about dead wood is that we now know, this is down to sort of that last bullet point on this slide, we know, at least in Western forests, that dead wood has as much as 4 times as much living biomass in it than living wood. So if you think about that for a second, that's pretty incredible. Dead wood supports this incredible range of different organisms, from fungi to invertebrates to stuff like salamanders. Salamanders are known sort of as the apex predator of the forest floor. They have this really important role in their role in being a predator towards these small organisms, to invertebrates, little things. And they actually account for the most biomass of any vertebrate predator in the eastern forest. So what that means is, if you took all the black bears and you took all the salamanders in the forest, the salamanders would weigh more. And deadwood is a really important habitat for them. And so making sure that we still have some deadwood on the forest floor is incredibly critical. A lot of these things, these invertebrates, fungi, are sort of like the forgotten parts of our forest. So they're the little things that make the world work, as E.O. Wilson would say. They're these incredibly important parts of our forest that, cycle nutrients and form the base of the food web, and do all these really important things that make everything else work. They're just harder for us to recognize because they're so small. So, one thing that happens if you go into a forest and you cut all the trees, or you cut all the big trees, is that you're not going to have this deposition of dead wood. And so you're not going to provide habitat for all these organisms and all these processes that are really important to forest growth in the long term. So here's just a really cool slide. So invertebrates are bugs, basically, right? So, just to sort of illustrate my point about how important these little things are, and again, they're important both in their role in breaking down wood, what we call cycling nutrients, and feeding bigger organisms that we care more about, that we see more. They are also this incredible repository of biodiversity in our forests. So here you see the number of species in Vermont without invertebrates. So you're like, okay, yeah, we got a bunch of mammals, and we got, a whole lot of birds passing through, fish, amphibians, reptiles. That is the number of species that we have with invertebrates. So we have 58 species of mammals and around 21,000 species of invertebrates. Globally, we have, somewhere between 2 and 10 million different species of invertebrates, estimated as high as perhaps 30 million species of invertebrates versus 60,000 species of vertebrates. E.O. Wilson calls them the little things that make the world work, and also thinks that we should characterize them as wildlife, because we think of, all the furry and feathered critters as wildlife, but we don't think of our incredibly important pollinators, and these nutrient cyclers, these other less cuddly creatures as being wildlife, even though they really are. So another feature that I mentioned that old growth forests have that we want to encourage in the forest is canopy gaps. So this is a really interesting one because, as a forester, you think about canopy gaps as, okay, I'm going to create a gap in the forest, and we're going to create, by creating that gap, or by encouraging that gap, we're going to get a pocket of regeneration, right? Because we're creating that negative space, light is hitting the forest floor, and just all this regeneration happens. It's this amazing part of forest regeneration. However, the gap itself, just creating that opening in the canopy, in addition to making your canopy more like the canopy of an old growth forest, it also provides some really unique habitat. So inside that gap, the air temperatures are going to be warmer. You're going to get higher insect densities, and then foraging, insectivorous birds will use those for foraging. So they'll perch on one side of the gap, fly out through the gap, catch insects, and perch on the other side of the gap. And creating canopy gaps is actually something that Audubon Vermont and other groups that advocate for specifically bird habitat, that they really want to see, because it provides that important habitat for those insectivorous birds. It does also, as a side note, increase the structural diversity of the forest by creating pockets of regeneration. And it also provides, important, anytime we're creating openings like this, it also provides opportunity for different species of plants and shrubs to occur. So for instance, raspberries and blackberries, which themselves are really important to wildlife, right? Because they're providing a place where a bear can go sit and eat blackberries in the middle of summer, or these migrating neotropical songbirds can pick up the energy that they need to, migrate thousands of miles south. Young forest, what is also called early successional forest, is also really important. So it's the most diverse forest we have if you think in terms of the sheer number of wildlife, tree, and plant species that use it. Utilized by a ton of different neotropical songbirds, and required by some species that we're concerned about on our landscape. So ruffed grouse, woodcock, American woodcock are two of them. And we know that it's underrepresented across our landscape. So we know that, the amount of young forest that we have now in our landscape is less than what we had prior to European settlement. So remember, thinking about our landscape as a whole, in addition to our forests not being as diverse as they were, maybe a few hundred years ago, our landscape also hasn't had a chance to get as diverse as it was a few hundred years ago. It supports a lot of these, what we call mast species, soft mast species. So mast is just a type of seed produced by a tree that animals eat. So cherries, raspberries, blackberries, these are all soft mast species. Hard mast is stuff like acorns, hickory nuts. Cherries, raspberries, and blackberries are all soft mast species that do really well in these young forest environments. So young forest, to create young forest, you need to create a bigger opening, like at least a couple of acres, probably more like a 5-acre area. This does happen also naturally. So at the Heinsberg Town Forest, which is a place I've worked a lot, there's a 40-acre blowdown. So when that happened, you had this massive area, it was the 2010 windstorm, if some of you remember that, December 2010. This huge wind came through and just blew over this whole forest. It was actually a pine plantation. It was 40 acres. Now, what that's allowed to happen is to get this incredible abundance of regeneration. And on that spot, 131 different species of birds have been sighted. And every time I go there in the spring, it's full of birders looking for unique species of birds that they wouldn't find anywhere else in the landscape. So again, while a bunch of trees falling over is really sad, it's also an opportunity for something else really cool to happen. So there are also, as we think about how to manage our forest and our landscape for wildlife, another thing we need to do is to address some threats. So these are human-created situations, elements that in some way threaten the ability of our forest to be healthy and for our wildlife to utilize them. Global change is a term that is basically, instead of talking strictly about climate change, a lot of us now talk about climate change in combination with a variety of other human-caused stressors. So this includes the fact that we've altered natural disturbance regimes. We're now getting increasingly severe and intense and frequent storm events. We've introduced invasive exotic plants, animals, pests, and pathogens to our landscape. We've converted forests to other stuff and fragmented them into smaller and smaller pieces. We've polluted our landscape. And so global change is basically, yes, the climate is changing, and also there's all this other stuff happening too. All that stuff combines to form some really esoteric and scary threats to our wildlife. And so we also need to recognize that our forest management and the way we manage for wildlife needs to be adaptive. So while old growth forests are a really useful reference that we can use, the forests of tomorrow, I often say, will be different than the forests of yesterday. Our climate's going to be different. The disturbances that shape our forests are going to be different. The ability of our forests to respond to those disturbances is going to be different. And so we want to manage forests which are adaptive, which are resilient, which just means that they can stay healthy amidst great stress, and they're able to cope with the fast-paced, drastic environmental changes of the future. One of the ways that we can manage our forests to be resilient is actually to manage them to be diverse. We can do that at the same time that we're managing for really great wildlife habitat. And by managing them to be resilient, we're also protecting the ecosystems that wildlife need to live. And so we're doing both things at the same time. Invasive biological invasions, invasive organisms are a huge, scary threat. They're considered a major threat to global biodiversity. They account for about half of all extinctions, of which the cause is known. Most of those are invasive animals, but also invasive plants, insects, and pests and pathogens. According to the National Wildlife Federation, 42% of endangered species are primarily threatened by invasive biological invasions. So we see on the left is the brown tree snake, which has, in Guam, there was only 12 native forest bird species, and basically has made all of them go extinct just by being introduced into a novel environment. And none of those species had adapted to respond to that kind of influence. Here in Vermont, we're dealing with invasive exotic plants, which decrease our ecosystem diversity, resiliency, health, their ability to sequester and store carbon, to provide wildlife habitat, basically by outcompeting our native species. Climate change will also probably benefit these plants. And one of the really weird things about dealing with some of these problems is that sometimes you got to do something that's really hard in order to do the right thing. So almost every conservation organization in Vermont uses herbicide in a really targeted and minimal way, which is not something that we want to be just like sprayed all across the landscape, but that we need to use to deal with these infestations of invasive exotic plants that are such a fundamental threat to our biodiversity. Forest loss is, sort of the thing that really keeps me up at night, especially in Chittenden County, because we can treat invasive plants, forests can recover from bad logging, we can deal with other problems, but development is essentially permanent, or effectively permanent. You can't get it back. And so, in many ways, a poorly logged forest, a forest that was logged really badly, in my eyes, is better than, let's say, a housing development, or than some other form of development that is going to cause a permanent impediment to the ability of our landscape to provide habitat for our wildlife. It happens in a bunch of different forms: development, conversion, parcelization, and fragmentation. Here, you see in Richmond this big block of forested habitat that someone just punched a driveway all the way up to the top of the hill, clear cut the ridgetop, and put houses there. How do we deal with this? We can advocate for, we don't want to make it so that we can't develop our communities, that our communities can't, that nobody else can move to our communities. However, one of the ways that we can do that, allow development to occur and allow our communities to have more people live here, and to protect our forests, is to advocate for denser development in some places. So in our city centers, in areas that are already fragmented, and keep it out of our bigger forest blocks. And if you want to do that, it's pretty easy to do. You can advocate for that at your local conservation commission or planning commission, the development of your town plan. Just by going to one of those meetings, you can really have a big impact in a positive way. And we also need to conserve permanently with conservation easements as much forested land as possible, so that those areas are permanently protected from development. Another thing that is an increasing threat, it's a huge monumental threat in states south of us, and not quite as much a threat here yet, but increasingly so, is deer overpopulations. So it's caused by climate change, the loss of those historic predators like wolves and catamounts, and limits on the current predator of deer, which is humans. So more and more posted land, less hunters. We have 50% of the hunters that we had in 1970. In 10 years, we expect to have 50% of the amount we have now, which is huge. And a more fragmented landscape, which prevents people from being able to hunt these areas and sort of exert our influence as a predator. They're a serious threat to biodiversity, mostly because they browse our native species. And where they're really bad, they can cause a process called forest disintegration, which is basically that trees continue to die as part of these, that beautiful cyclical part of forest development where change happens. Mortality is a really good thing, but no regeneration occurs and the forest just falls apart. So that's something actually this year, our deer hunting regulations were changed to try and lower deer populations in some parts of the state for that reason, so we can head this problem off before it becomes really bad. So there are also, like I said, I'm a tinkerer, so I'm also interested in ways to manage our forests. So I practice a type of forestry called ecological forestry or ecological forest management. And the big idea with ecological forestry is that we're managing forests not like a bank account, not just for, what can these forests give us and how do we manage them just to, provide us with the most value and the most wood possible. We want to manage forests, yes, for local renewable resources, but we want to manage them like they manage themselves. So taking cues from old growth forests, taking cues from the way that forests change and develop over time, and managing forests like that. And actually even proactively trying to make forests more like old growth forests, recognizing that diverse forests and having dead wood on the ground and all of these features that old growth forests have and most of our forests today don't have, creating those features is actually going to be an incredible benefit to our forests and also to the wildlife that utilize them. Managing for what I call complexity is incredibly important, and also recognizing that they're complex systems. So we're managing the trees, but we're not managing them just for trees. We're managing them as a whole system. And we also want to manage for ecologically healthy landscapes. So, trying to make across our landscape, in addition to making our individual forests more diverse, making our entire landscapes more diverse, proactively, making young, simple forests more resilient, diverse, and complex, more like old growth forests, creating pockets of habitat that might be underrepresented across the landscape, which could include creating like young forests, bigger openings. We also want to allow some forests to be unmanaged, and there's no reason why, with the amount of old growth forests we have left on our landscape, that we should ever cut old growth forests again. And we should, create more areas that are going to be allowed to develop without management. And we should also address threats like invasive exotic plants and forest loss, fragmentation, development, deer overpopulations, address those landscape level threats proactively. Making our landscapes, in addition to our individual forests, our landscapes more resilient and functional, which is going to be a huge benefit to wildlife. So in practice, what this looks like, and I've got 9 more minutes, so I'm going to speed up here a little bit so I have some chance to answer some of your questions. In practice, what this means is that we're doing management. Yes, when I'm actually managing an area, I'm cutting trees. I'm not cutting them, but a logger is cutting trees that I designate. But I'm managing instead of managing like a plantation, I'm managing for many different ages, sizes, and species of trees. I'm creating gaps in the canopy. I'm retaining and creating lots of dead wood. I'm leaving big trees. And also the purpose of those trees is not to continue to get big and be really valuable. The purpose of those trees is just to be a big tree, to afford to the forest the benefits of big trees, and eventually to be a big dead tree. You should try telling a logger that sometime. It blows their minds. And also creating small pockets of early successional habitat and other unique habitats across our landscape while we're protecting sensitive and unusual features. So a lot of this gets into, there's a lot of fear about managing the landscape in general. Most people who love the landscape and appreciate the benefits of forests and other ecosystems are really scared to be involved, partially because humans have not had a good track record at all of managing that. Right here in the background, you see a picture of the eastern elk, which was one of our native herbivores on our landscape that's now extinct. We have not had a good track record at all. We live in a highly altered world. Some people describe the era that we're in right now as the Anthropocene, a geologic epoch that's defined by human activity. We have 50% of the number of animals on the planet that there were in 1970. So not 50% of the species, but 50% of the actual number of animals that existed here 50 years ago, and created massive global problems. So we were in the middle of a mass extinction, mass reduction in global biodiversity, the impacts of climate change, the impacts of these invasive exotic organisms and pests and pathogens. We live in altered, degraded, shrinking, fragmented ecosystems, and in Vermont alone have extirpated some native animals, driven several to extinction. In this context, we need to think about, not just going like this and putting our hands up and saying, okay, we're going to keep our hands off from now on. There are things that we can do to help this. And there are things that we can do to both on a fine filter level and on a coarse filter level to do management that's actually regenerative and that actually helps our wildlife and is not just, shielding them from our impacts, but is actually regenerative, positive, restorative. And I think in that role, we can really be a keystone species. So in managing for wildlife in a broader context, again, talking about sometimes you got to do things that are momentarily unpleasant for the bigger good. You know, one of the things that I'm really proud to do, even though I love trees, is to cut trees sometimes. So managing forests, again, proactively to be more diverse, more complex. And then also, if we're managing forests really well and we're creating amazing wildlife habitat, we're also using local renewable resources, right? Instead of non-local, non-renewable resources. And in doing that, we're supporting global ecosystems, which are broadly threatened by resource consumption, resource processing. A lot of times we don't have to deal with the worst aspects of this because so often we're using resources from somewhere else, but those impacts are still there and they're affecting wildlife on a global scale. So when we're using local resources, we have more control over what those impacts are. By rejecting this sort of not in my backyard mentality, we're refusing to just displace the impacts of our resources on someone else. We're saying, okay, even if this is uncomfortable, you know, I don't like seeing trees cut. Even if that is the case, I'm going to sort of let that be here instead of just displacing those impacts onto someone who doesn't have the privilege to say not in my backyard. Allowing people to manage their forests also lowers development pressure by allowing people who own forests, again, mostly private landowners, to have a little money to pay for their taxes so they don't have to be taxed off their land. So all of these things protects wildlife and biodiversity in Vermont and then also globally. And I think that one of the things we can do that is, you know, maybe less tangible than going out in your woods and pulling up invasive plants or, you know, creating, you know, pruning an apple tree, a wild apple tree or something like that. Thinking really hard about where our resources come from and the resources we consume is a huge way that we can protect wildlife across the globe. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I would love to, if there are any questions, I would love to take some. I know that that's a lot, a lot of stuff that I just said. So if you have a question, you can either, probably the easiest way would be to type it into that chat box. If you look up into the top right hand part of your screen, there's a little chat icon and you can plug in the question that you have. Well, seeing none. Oh,
there are some hands.
Oh, here they come. Why not? Jill says, why not reintroduce the catamount? It's a good question. Well, so there's a, yeah, so I mean, out west, so there has been some predator. I'm not really qualified to talk about predator reintroductions, and I'd probably like lose my job if I started to really talk about it. But the out west, there has been some predator reintroductions where they've been successful, right? So they've actually caused, you know, some broader ecosystem changes, like we've seen out in Yellowstone with wolf reintroductions, influencing herbivory, so the elk, and then that influence causes distinct changes in ecosystems, which is pretty cool. I think that the argument against doing something like that here would be that they're dealing with a completely different scale of undeveloped space. So out here, we're like packed in here pretty tight compared to what they have out there, which is millions and tens of millions of acres of public land for those animals to roam. But like, you know, it would be cool. Like I'm definitely in principle, like introducing predators sounds like a cool idea. However, you know, I guess logistically it's a little bit more complicated than that. You know, there's a, yeah, I'll just say that. I mean, I think one of the things with deer, you know, I really started hunting deer 7 or 8 years ago, seeing the impacts of deer browse and how that reduces biodiversity in our forest, which can be really kind of scary. And being like, wow, I really need to be a predator of this animal. Another interesting predator fact is that coyotes are not native to Vermont. Deer are barely native to Vermont. They were here in a couple little pockets, but our main species of herbivores were caribou and elk 300 years ago, that eastern elk. And our apex predators were catamounts and wolves. Coyotes weren't even here until the 1940s. But anyway, yeah, so definitely, at least in lieu of that, there is a role that humans can play in the landscape as a predator, which I think is really important and powerful. Richard says, talk about the role of controlled fires. Prescribed burning is not something that, well, so I guess there's two parts to that question. So there's the sort of Paleolithic and pre-European use of fires by native peoples to influence our forests, which is really important. And then also the use of controlled burns today. So the out west, fire is much more of a disturbance vector. It's much more present across the landscape, both historically and today, than out here. We do have ecosystems that burn, and that we have evidence of, frequent low intensity fires in some of these areas and species that are adapted to fires. But there's not a lot of prescribed burning being done in Vermont, except at some of our wildlife management areas and some weird special places where those really fire adapted ecosystems. Native people in this definitely did do some burning, more so where there were larger populations of native people, like around Cape Cod, and in sort of southern New England coastal areas. There was a lot of understory burning that happened for hundreds of thousands of years. In Vermont, there was a little bit, but we think maybe that was less of an influence on our landscape. But in general, fires really are out here in the Northeast, our version of fires, like, sort of what fires are to the west, windstorms are here. That's our main disturbance vector. That's the main thing that's killing trees and causing these big openings and disturbances. Stefan says, is holding a portion of forest to not touch a part of all management plans? No. So in the current use program, the use value appraisal program is its official name. Technically, you can't, unless it's an area that's already old growth, you can't keep it as old growth. It has to be, in theory, actively managed. There could be huge intervals of time between different management intervals. So like you could, do some harvesting of trees and then not do anything else for 50 years. But you're not supposed to have that. So having a little area that you don't manage actively is something you can do, but it's certainly not a part of all forest management plans. Although it's something that on town forests we've been doing more and more. So town forests aren't in the current use program. And on a lot of these town forests, there's a whole bunch of different users, people who are interested in different aspects of the forest, people who want a lot of use for recreation, management, et cetera, people who want no use. And so what we do is we'll divide up the forest into different zones. So the Heinsberg Town Forest has zones like this. The Andrews Community Forest in Richmond has zones like this. There'll usually be 3 of them. One is a zone in which more recreational usage and more management is allowed. One is sort of a moderate recreational usage, moderate level management. And one is an area where almost no recreational usage or no recreational usage and no management occurs. And so what that allows us to do is sort of talking about having ecologically functional landscapes. So having lots of different things going on the landscape, diverse landscapes. It allows us to provide different types of stuff within a single property. So we're providing both, in the case of the Andrews Community Forest, we're providing pockets of young forest. We're providing areas that we're managing actively to make them more structurally diverse and more like old growth forests. And there are areas where we're going to allow to just do that on their own. And all those things are really valuable. And they benefit each other. So providing all of those things for wildlife is really important. Any other questions? So how do we create old growth? So you can't. So here's the thing, and this is a term from the scientific literature. You can't make old growth, but you can make forests old growthier.
Sure.
So that's a lot of what I do. So I'm an advocate both of keeping forests unmanaged sometimes, and I'm an advocate of making young forests more like old growth forests actively. And the reason for that is because the features of old growth forests, that structural diversity, big trees, dead wood on the ground, that our young forests don't have, those are features which are important to forest health, their resilience to climate change, and to wildlife habitat, right? And those are features that will occur naturally. In lieu, there are things like invasive plants that could throw a wrench in that, but those are things that will happen naturally over time. But in the case of many of our native species, I want to create habitat for those species now. And so I'm not willing to wait, 200 years for all the forests on our landscape to become old growth naturally. So that's why it's cool to have sort of the balance. When I'm making forests more like old growth forests, I'm primarily using the cutting of trees as a tool. And by doing that, it means that the forests that I'm managing are not exactly equivalent to old growth, right? Because in an old growth forest, every tree that dies just falls on the ground and it's just there. And all of these things just sort of happen naturally. But I can't make an old growth forest, but I can make a forest that has a lot of those important attributes that old growth forests have. And so that's the cool thing about, like at the Andrews Community Forest, where we're doing both of those things on the same property. We're actively creating those attributes now, and we're allowing them to develop naturally.
What do you see the Emerald Ash Borer doing for us now? How is that going to change things?
Yeah, I don't know. There's a bunch of different. The Emerald Ash Borer, for those of you who don't know, is it's an invasive pest from Asia, and it's in Vermont, increasingly so, and it's in like 32 or 33 other states as well. And it basically kills almost all ash trees. And so what that means is that, probably most of our ash trees, at least in the short term, are going to die. In the woods, ash trees provide really important ecosystem functions. Every tree species touches its environment in a little bit of a different way, and provides different opportunities for different species of wildlife and supports different ecosystem processes. So losing a tree species is not ideal. However, there is a tiny little bit of resistance, and we're hoping that over time that ash will, we won't lose ash on our landscape. There have been some other examples of different pests that are existential threats to a specific tree species, but haven't quite driven it to extinction. So like the chestnut blight is a version of that. We still have some chestnuts, mostly just growing sort of as a shrub, little sprout, but they're still here. Dutch elms disease killed basically all big elms and still kills elms once they get to be about 10 inches in diameter, almost all of them, but hasn't driven it to extinction. Butternut canker is another one. Most of our butternut trees are really, really sick. So I guess the effect of the emerald ash borer is not good, but it's another argument for managing for diversity in our forests, and trying to create forests which are not just dominated by a single species of tree. Managing for diversity and complexity is really, really important. So if you just, like, as a landowner, you like ash trees, and so you managed your entire forest to be ash trees, you'd be in a pickle right now. You'd be in trouble, and the health of that forest would be in trouble because you put all your eggs in one basket. That's one of the reasons why both in our forests and on our streets too, because the same thing happened in a lot of neighborhoods that planted like 100% green ash trees. On our streets, we also want to cultivate diversity, and in our neighborhoods and our communities. So there, what I'm doing for emerald ash borer is, in some cases, cutting some ash trees to try and capture some of that value, where that's important to a landowner. Some landowners are like, I need to get some of the value of these trees before they die. but also leaving a lot of ash trees, and especially big seed-bearing ash trees, and actually creating conditions to try and regenerate ash, because through the regeneration process, we're going to create some more genetic diversity, and our hope is that eventually we'll be cultivating resistant genetics so that we'll have that species left on our landscape. But definitely one thing that's really important that people need to know is that, you know, a lot of people are like, the emerald ash borer is coming. I have to protect my community, I have to cut all the ash trees in my forest. And that has absolutely no influence over the emerald ash borer at all. It doesn't help. And so, you know, if you do nothing, your ash trees are going to die. They're going to fall on the ground. It's not great. You're going to, you know, losing those species is not good for your forest, but they'll be dead wood, which will be loved by many different things. They'll get, you know, turned into soil and turned into more trees, hopefully. Let's make this the last question. So Richard Allen asked, what is your background? I'm from Southern Vermont, Windham County. I'm from Saxtons River and went to school at UVM. Didn't know what I wanted to study, did a bunch of other stuff. I did a little bit of logging with draft horses. I did some wilderness guiding. And then I decided I wanted to study forests, I wanted to study forestry, which at the time I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it had the word forest in it. So that's what I ended up picking. I worked as a consulting forester in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine for a few years, and then ended up getting this job 5 years ago. About, you know, I'll tell you what. One of the cool things, a lot of the places I worked as a consulting forester were on these sort of industrial land holdings, which is a really important experience for me. Different kind of forest management, more about production than about ecology, but really, really important influence over the way that I now think about forests. So I guess the last thing that I'll say is that if you want to stay posted about some of the events that I'm doing, yeah, I do have a mailing list, and I can put a link to that in the chat, and you can also let me just bring that up. And you can also email me, and I'll send you the link. And I send out, like most weeks, I'll send out a you know, an email with a bunch of different stuff, interesting stuff going on, different virtual events for myself and some partners and stuff. I'm also in the middle of a couple demonstration projects. So at the Andrews Community Forest in Richmond, and also at the Catamount Community Forest in Williston, we're doing a couple different things that we're really trying to just help people understand, you know, what healthy forests are like and how we can manage them really well. So all of that, you can learn more about that by staying tuned to my mailing list. And then also I have a YouTube channel. You can just search for Chittenden County Forester on YouTube. And it'll pop right up, and you'll see I do all kinds of videos, and I put recordings of all the different webinars and virtual events that I do up on there as well. And then if you have other questions, you can just send me an email. I'm going to type my email into the chat here too. And I want to say thanks to Martha for organizing the event. Martha, do you have anything else you want to say?
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to Ethan for being so patient and getting this organized. We've been working on this for a year. We were going to do it virtually and then unvirtually. And so thank you, Ethan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Happy holidays, everybody.
Thank you.